Three, two, one. All right, we're recording. All right. Ay, 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 ay. That'll give you a little bit of coffee. About 4:30 in
This
the
will cheer you
afternoon.
up if you want to get started
Uh,
with your day on a podcast, listening about artificial intelligence and machine learning. Right.
mhm.
Today we have Nevin, and always lucky. Lucky to have Lucky here. Just amazing conversation all around. But the conversation we started with last year with Nevin. It's been a while since we last spoke, but I've been waiting to have this conversation.
Welcome back.
Like, yes, Nevin, welcome back. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah. So in
Good to
this
be here, guys.
podcast, we focus a lot about military veterans. We want them to understand that, hey, there's a career out here for the military veterans, that military veterans should really focus into the AI machine learning side of career fields, whichever being either a developer or somebody who is monitoring this AI machine learning activities. And we talk about startups. We have tons of ideas about startups. And we talk about hardware. We tend to focus on these three topics: military veterans, startups, and hardware. But none of this conversation will make any sense unless we're talking about data, right? And how do we approach data means how you end up with those data and what those data ends up doing for you. Return on your investment, return on your data, all matters on how much of a strategy you had behind those data. And me and Nevin, we've been going back and forth discussing these topics. We have tons of efforts that we can put into have people understand this data strategy far better than what they need to understand about AI machine learning, because AI machine learning is not that important when we start looking at the data strategy. AI machine learning is just an output. Input is what matters.
Exactly.
Garbage in and garbage out, right? So, Lucky, where is your thought process on this? I know you deal with a lot of data on a daily basis as well.
Yeah. Well, it's the old. What is AI, and and so the truth of the matter is, again, and we're going to get into it, is you know it, what is your data source? What are you really trying to do? And we had a little bit of conversation earlier, and Nevin's going to kind of give us a really good idea of when it today's strategies and what people are trying to do because of AI being a hot topic, and what are the focus areas? What are you really trying to build? And so for data, for me, I knew I'm an old data warehouse guy and security guy, so I know that for me the data, there's a lot of different phases of it, but getting it to where you're getting the right outputs, how does that affect AI? And so I think that's the big question right now, and Nevin, you know give us your perspective. That's there's phases, from deep learning to, machine learning to AI, but we everyone's like they're quick to kind of just hop right straight into AI, and then and cyborgs. So break this down, make it real for us.
Yeah.
You know.
It all starts with data, right? You got to start with the facts. And the challenge we have is when people hear data strategy, it's like, hey, great, what's your governance? And I'm like, well, what do you mean by governance? Well, we need to standardize the data. Well, when you standardize it, you kind of sub-optimize it. I mean, I was talking with the CTO over at Harvard. We were chatting one day on this topic, and it's like, it's interesting. I mean, just think of it like an algebraic equation: x plus y minus z times, q equals a for answer, right? And these letters are variables. Now, Webster tells me that, and I listen to Webster's, variables are things that are changing, but everybody wants to standardize it, which seems kind of counterproductive. So, data will grow, evolve, change, transform over time. The facts, because they do change. They aren't stagnant, right? The right answer today might not be the right answer tomorrow because the environment influence affects the data in interesting ways, right? And then when you plug these facts into these variables, the data, against these relationships, these minuses, pluses, and all, you get this output. Now, MIT does a really great job kind of breaking it down to its essence. Because, I always tried to figure out, we built the center of the National Test Lab for testing and evaluating AI and ML. One of the things we really wanted to understand is how do you qualify and quantify these things, so you can determine, is this a good process or not. And what we realized by that is, these facts, in and as they are, in this formula, into these relationships, come up with what MIT defines as an if then else. Okay, so and to be clear, AI has been around for a very long time. It's just recently been well known, so everybody thinks it's this new really exciting thing. But it was coined back in the 50s, and it existed well prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
So when a human says, if then else, under that criteria, you make your cognitive decisions. Well, in an artificial sense, the machine does the same thing, but it has to have these boundaries for if then else, right? So you establish this criteria upon which you evaluate what you have. But before you can even do that in the analysis phase, okay, and everybody jumps right in the middle of the movie on that, you really have to stop and reflect, okay? What is the quality, as Steve said, garbage in, garbage out, right? What is the quality of the data that you're feeding this formula? And everybody presumes it to be, oh, it's 100%. Well, let's just look at this realistically. Nothing's ever 100%, but you need to know at what level of quality the data is, so you understand how much, credibility it provides, right? Such that you know how much confidence you can have on it, so you know how much you can trust the outputs. So, you have to determine that. And the challenge here is data is growing, like doubling almost every year and a half. Okay. And then you have a lot of data that's duplicated across, different planes. That's why I don't like warehouses or lakes. I've never seen a warehouse that wasn't, well organized and structured. And there's not just one warehouse, there's multiple warehouses. Yeah. And I've never seen a lake that wasn't, convoluted in some respect. So what you have to really look at is, the analogy I use is, a person with one watch knows what time it is. Whether it's right or wrong, that's a common reference point. Now, a person with two watches never quite sure, because they're never in sync with each other, right? In my time in the military, it really wasn't as important to have the right time as it was to have the same time. Okay. As a matter of fact, if the time was off, that actually kind of worked to our favor, because we wanted the element of surprise, right? We wanted to show up at, high noon, but if we're off by an hour there and they heard we're coming at high noon, and we were early, we got surprised. And if we're late, we got surprised either. And the whole goal here is to have surprise, but it's to synchronize our efforts. So when you do a comparative analysis on data in its disaggregated and disassociated state, you have to make sure you find some mechanism to do that. So let's start with the basics. The first thing you have to do with data is organize it, and that's called an enterprise information model. Okay, and that model helps you understand. Think of it like a library. In a library, I could have a warehouse of a bunch of books, and I'm going to do a research project on, say, I don't know, dogs. And so I got to sort through this big pile of books, like 50,000 books, and find all the books on dogs. And then after I find all the books on dogs, I got to figure out which ones are applicable to my research. Well, the library is really kind of clever. They've come up with this thing called a card catalog, probably heard of it. And it tells you, what are you looking for? Something on dogs. Okay. Where it is. Okay. It's on these shelves. When it was written, who wrote it. I mean, all this important facts that are really helpful to get you right to the core of it. So that's the organizational portion of the enterprise information model. And this is what we have to do with data. Okay. And then once we have it organized, now it's hopefully fit for purpose. And then we have to apply it specific to our specific need, operationally relevant, in this information model. So data organized becomes information, and information structured, right, against this formula, X plus Y plus Z, gives you answers, or analytical information, which we call knowledge. Analytical information has a nice acronym. It's AI. Kind of catchy, I think. So, and I'm not.
I stole that from you the last time.
I didn't come up with that. I've got a lot of really high-end folks in industry that understand this very well, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about it. So when I was doing work with over at the White House, and they'd asked me to work with industry and public-private partnerships on AI, because obviously it's this new up-and-coming thing. And I went to this first meeting that we had. And I thought a very obvious question: what's AI? And everybody looked at me dumbfounded. It's like, you don't know? No, I don't. I'm smart enough to know I'm stupid. Help me understand it. Well, AI is AI. And it's like, well, wait a minute. You can't define a dog in terms of a dog, and you can't define AI like an AI. It's like, but that's what it is. So it's kind of like an ukana. They're like, well, what? An ukana? What's an ukana? An ukana is an ukana. You don't know what an
Not me
ukana
on
is.
that one.
And it's like, no, really, what is it? It's nothing. I made it up. Just like you're playing along with AI. I can play the same
Ah,
game. And there's like, okay, wait a minute. I said, break it down.
yeah, okay.
And there's like, well, what do you need to get the if then else? Well, that's just a formula. Okay, got it. That's like basic programming. I did that many, many years ago. But the formula without data, it's like a car without gas. And it's like, yeah. So, and if I put bad gas in the car, it's not going to run. Right. I put bad data in the car, it's not going to work. Right. And what would you rather have? Would you rather have data that's 90% accurate? Oh, yeah, that's what I want. Well, let me finish the option. Or would you rather have a formula that's 90% functional? Well, I'd rather have perfect facts. It's like, well, this is the interesting part. So if your data is not 100%, it's 10% off, then it'll skew the outcome, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if your formula, the relational piece of this is 10% off, it will also skew the outcome, but significantly more so than the data being off. So how do you make sure that the data is accurate? Well, I don't want to use it if it's not perfect. Well, then you're never going to do anything. See, here's the interesting part.
Mm-hmm.
The more you use data, the more accurate it becomes. It's a trust but verify situation, right? Even if you only think it's 20% accurate. So if you have two options available to you, right? Mm-hmm. And you don't know which one's better, you're never going to know until you try each of the options. And then through the application of use, you'll quickly realize. So data works the same kind of way. Nice. So let's start this. The enterprise information model organizes the data so you can hopefully deconflict it, right? And start to understand what it is, where it is, when it is. I mean, if I do a book report on dogs, right, I'm going to get a couple of different authors on the same topic in the same focus areas, so I can do a comparative analysis to figure out, okay, who's got the right perspective on this. And some are going to be right on some things, and some are going to be right on other things. But in all things, there's going to be some consternation that I have to deconflict in order to figure this out. That's the purpose of doing the analysis or the assessment, excuse me. And then once I've done that, then I get to the analysis portion. And the analysis portion, I take the data to the best that I know that it is, and I process it. But if I know the data is only 70% accurate, right, then I understand the output's probably 70% or less reliable. But at least I know what I'm working with. And then through the process of learning it, then we get to this thing we call knowledge. And knowledge is what your answers is. And everybody's happy with that. I mean, in our schools, you take a course and they test you on your ability to repeat what the instructor said. That's, what is the answer? I don't know how you got the answer. I just know what it is, and I got an A. Right. But you don't have any understanding. And this is what we really should be focusing on. So what we really have to do is a 5-step process, is we have to take the data, and then we have to make those assessments against how reliable, what's the veracity of that data, how accurate is it, and then we have to put it into the formula through its application, make it operationally relevant, to build a knowledge base, which over time we can, test and verify that, and in order to get to a level of understanding. So this guy called John Boyd, really smart guy, Air Force colonel, developed this thing called an OODA loop. And the OODA loop was really interesting. It's an acronym, stood for observe, okay? And he observed the facts and accepted them for what they were. And then he applied them to understand how much credibility they offered and how much confidence he can have in them through the orientation of them. In other words, those relational dependencies that you have when you put it in an exponential equation or an algebraic equation. Mm-hmm. And then he made decisions based on the availability, understanding they're only going to be as good as what he had. And he didn't make the decisions to get the answers, okay? He made the decisions in order to create an action to test trust but verify, in order to loop. And the most important part of his process was the loop, because here's the thing: it is not a serial process, not even a parallel process, and it's not a sequence. It's a continual process of improvement, and it's through that looping portion that he was learning. So his whole goal was not to have the right answer or even the best answer. His whole goal was to improve as he went. So John Boy was a fighter pilot. Long story short, and he realized he wasn't very good. I was fortunate on early in his early days, so I'm not saying anything he wouldn't have said for himself. And he wanted to get better. So what
Yeah.
he did is he challenged all of his colleagues,
Mhm.
knowing full well he was going to lose, but every time he lost, he would learn something, right? And get better to eventually be able to, hold his own. And so he decided that rather they make a decision every minute, and he was going to make a decision every 10 seconds, which means he gets to 6 decisions for every one they make. Now, keeping in mind, every time he makes a decision, he's not expected to be perfect, and he's not looking to justify it. He's looking to learn from it. So he has 6 opportunities to iterate per their one. And it didn't take long before John was doing equal or better than them, and that was his process. So what we did from that is we created this ACE model. Now the ACE model stands for, kind of staying in tune with the fighter pilot vernacular, if you will, is once you've observed the data, right, make an assessment as to what's the quality of that data. Okay. And then once you orient it, plug into the formula in order to structure it, which is an ETL, which we'll get back to in a second here, then you will be able to characterize the influences that create effect. In other words, what those relationships impact and influence have on the outcomes.
Mhm.
And then from there, when you make decisions, right, you become enlightened, not from the decisions being right or wrong, but how could you make them better next time, right? It's this evolutionary process, and you're empowered to act based on the limited information you have, knowing full well you're probably going to make it, might even fail, but you're not afraid of failure because your goal isn't to be right. Your goal is to improve and learn, and then so that you can loop in order to learn and evolve. And it's this evolutionary process that even if you're better than I am, but I'm growing faster than you are, eventually I will equal and surpass you, which gives you your strategic competitive advantage. So let me go back to those 5 steps real quick. And that is, you organize the data, you structure the information, and that's a big challenge in and of itself, because that's ETL, extract, transect, and load. When you have all these different computational equations, they don't always have the same data in every one of them. Some of them don't have any data on it at all, so you can't do a comparative analysis. They call that a null set. So the question you have to ask yourself is, do you average mean what you have, or do you just ignore the null set, let it work itself out in the wash? Either way you do it, that's going to inject errors into the process. But that's something you have to accept in order to get to the looping portion to learn, right? And then you build this knowledge base that where everybody stops. Hey, I got the right answer. I compared it to yours, and we're both right, and you're wrong, so that makes us right because there's more of us than there are of you. That groupthink kind of comes and sets in, and it's so that moving beyond that, you get to understanding. So so the planning portion or business intelligence piece comes after the analytical information piece, which is delivered in the decision, in order to get to the cognitive intelligence piece of how can I evolve, learn in the planning piece, which is the enlightening, to get into the programming portion to be able to create better results than everybody else. So it's kind of hard to describe without a graph. I've got some graphs for that, but to the point here is this: it all starts with data, and you have to understand, like a relay, where you start, where you hand off to information, and then you hand off to the knowledge runner, and they hand off to the understanding runner in order to get to the last runner, and that is wisdom. And the wisdom runner understands what to do at the right time, when to do it, the right place, where to do it, and the right way, how to do it. So it's the what, when's, where's, and how's it gets you to the why. So with all that in mind, as you begin with the end in mind, you really have to start the data efforts as you organize that to understand, what data you have so you can deconflict it, where it is, like a library on the shelf, when was it written so you know the sequence of events, who wrote it so you understand what level of credibility they bring to the conversation. And then that will help you understand how best to apply it so you can get after your why. Why is this relevant, in germane to your specific application. So that's a really intense, a formula and framework, excuse me, that you have to understand, that it all begins with data. And if you don't start well, you can't possibly end well. But that's just the start of the 5-step process.
As you're speaking, the whole time I was just thinking about that visual of that cartoon that says like, who doesn't like messy AI? Everybody raises their hand like, we don't like messy AI. Who's gonna clean up the data? Nobody, and nobody raises their hand, right? Because the people
No,
will be more amused by an AI that doesn't work rather than to clean up the data, because that's the hard part of it. And having a messy data impacts our daily lives, right? As in, if your Google Map somehow told you that you will end up in Australia in 11 hours if you drive, you know, uh, that's not a good machine learning or an AI. That's a messy map that nobody wants. But the thing is, like this data, if, no matter how far you live from the technology, this data will impact you, one way or another. As in, you are the data collector, right? And so if you can visualize yourself as a intelligent system that has to gather this data, process this data, and put this data through a good labeling process, and then through those labeling process, you're able to make decisions. So, like you mentioned, that AI, BI, and CI, right? The fact that you're able to get answer from artificial intelligence, options from business intelligence, but you cannot make decisions until you have a cognitive intelligence, and that cognitive intelligence is what enables you to make those decisions. But just like in our reality, just in our daily lives, what we experience is far more of that movie, that what happens in the movie rather than what we need to do in order to have what the movies have, right? Like, we don't want to go through that dirty grind of cleaning up the dirty data. Even if we end up with a messy AI, we'd rather have somebody else clean up the data, right? So, in this podcast, like every time somebody brings up a movie reference, I just laugh because, like, that's our favorite topic to talk about. Because last time you were here, we talked about Star Trek. But movies are a giant giveaway into the problem that we are discussing right now. So the fact that everybody wants what's in the movie, but nobody knows how to make that movie. Nobody knows how to, step away from the TV and say, like, now I have to actually go out into the nature, find those ways of developing that technology. So once it's developed, it's not developed right the first time. It's 70% accurate, but there's no AI out there that is 100% accurate. It's most confident and highly accurate. That's what an AI is, right? And I think you mentioned earlier, like, uh, call it an AI or call it a dog. What difference does it make, right? Like, for me, I call it an AI as a
Mhm.
uh, augmented intelligence, right? Like augmenting the intelligence that we have. Whatever intelligence we have, if there's an AI out there doing the job that we don't know what it's doing, it's not part of our intelligence because it's not augmenting us, right? So the type of AI that we want to develop, we have to get involved in it, right? Because there's AI that's doing whatever the AI does, and we don't know much about it, or we cannot trust it or verify it. We cannot explain what that AI is doing, or neither can the AI explain to us what it's doing, right? So we have to kind of reverse engineer into everything you just said, right? Back into that, like, stop and think, look at the data, assess it, and then what do you want to do with it next? Ask the good question so you get the right answers from it, right? So I love everything you said. Thank you so much for breaking it down in that level.
of course. One of the challenges, though, that we learned, is collecting the data is hard, and nobody wants to give it up. So I thought.
Mhm.
And what we finally came to realize is you're not giving it up. There's a discovery phase, just to know that it exists. Think of it like a phone book. I know where you live. Well, I don't want you to know where I live. Why? You're not going to let me in your house. There's a searching portion after discovery. and you're either going to let me in or I'm going to have a warrant. You know what I'm saying? So the searching is the access control, right? Either you let me in, or I force my way in, or I use legal means to get a warrant. And short of that, I'm not coming in, right? So the fact that I know where you are is not necessarily a bad thing, but it was hard, and not knowing that in the discovery phase that we have 5 sources for the same piece of data. That's important, because if you ask somebody, hey, you have this data, yeah, I'm the subject matter expert and I'm the authoritative source for this data. Really? Because I've heard that same story from 4 other people today. You know, and I don't know which one to listen to. I know you're all lying because your lips are moving. So, I mean, what are we going to do with that? So, what we have to do is get discovery, not to try to, to understand how many versions of the truth we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then in the search phase, after we've organized that, as we begin to structure it, we can do a comparative analysis. And the reality here is, we've come to learn, is there isn't one version of the truth, right? There's many perspectives. And as you begin to appreciate the multitude of perspectives, then you have a better appreciation of not just what the right answer is how did you come up upon that answer. Churchill said something really, really great a long time ago. He says, the further back I can look, or he could look, the further forward he could see. Think about like the stock market, right? If you're going to do a good analysis on the stock market, you don't take one reference point or you're going to lose your shirt. You take as many reference points, historically speaking, and do temporal analytics against it to determine, characterize, of what's the potential of each stock. If I want to make a lot of money, I don't buy expensive stocks so I can make a lot of money. I want to have low risk, I buy penny stocks. It's actually the inverse. But it's all about how these things, how the characteristics of these stocks perform. But to your point, one of the things we came to realize as we were getting to knowledge, and Cornell did some really great work in this area, is there's the knowns, there's the unknowns, and there's the unknowables. And interestingly enough, the unknowable space is usually in the 70% or more.
Mm-hmm.
Even when I think I have 90% of the facts knowns, that means I only have 10% unknowns. But if at least 70% is unknowable, then I don't have 90% of the facts. I have 27% of the facts. And who's going to make a decision on 27%? That's bad odds, especially in Vegas, right? But ignorance is bliss, because I don't know. I make a decision. It doesn't quite come out the way I want, but now I understand what I can do to do it better the next time, the learning process, and we move forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is actually, ignorance is actually blessed in this area. But because we're so afraid of making a mistake, in our fear of failure, we don't move. So we become frozen and complacent. And most of us recognize that, we want to make good decisions, but usually the worst decision is no decision, or being undecisive. So when we start getting into this decision space, because the whole goal here, as most would recognize in the cognitive process, is to make good or informed decisions. And informed decisions are based on the facts in a right right perspective or relational dependency, in order to help understand how those influence are going to create the effect through the knowledge space in the future space. But we as we model this, ACT did a great job for the White House of talking about this framework of modeling. Descriptive modeling is literally about that historic data that Churchill was speaking about, that informed perceptions and paradigms and a whole bunch of other factors, right? How we see the world, given our past experience. And then predictive modeling, everybody thinks, oh, that's the future. It's like, actually, no, it's not. It's a probabilistic deterministics, okay, of what you have from what you got, right? And then prescriptive modeling are those options. What choices can you make given your circumstances and your situation. And then potentiality modeling, which is really coming in its own. It was developed about 14, 15 years ago. I first introduced it at Oxford University, and people are really starting to kind of dive into that, which is, what opportunities can I capitalize on with the available options? And people are starting to realize, wait a minute. So you're telling me I can create my own opportunities? Yes, you absolutely can. And if you don't know where you're going, the good news is all road will get you there. They call it being lost and meandering the minefields. But when you know where you want to be, then you can start exploring those options that get you in that direction. And if it's important for you to go in a short distance or a short time, you can manage to either of those priorities to figure out what opportunities will get you there in accordance with your goals, what objectives serve those goals. So as we start looking more at this cognitive process, right, and understanding how data starts the whole thing off, but it's not a one and done thing. It's this iterative circular process of evolution and building upon itself that, the first time through, we really don't know. Everybody says, I'm going to train my AI algorithm. Well, first of all, you're really not training it. I mean, and a lot of
Yeah.
people say, well, machine learning is a subset of AI. Not really. I mean, AI's purpose is to come up with answers, given the if then else, or take actions under a prescribed framework. Think of Hal in 2001: A Space Odyssey, right? He just followed directions. But when his directions and his reference
Mm.
points ceased to exist, then he didn't
Mm.
know how to deal with that. In terms of what? I don't know what you're talking about. You now switched languages on me, or there's a different environment, or nothing's adding up. 2 plus 2 no longer equals 4.
Mhm.
So if you look at that, then when you start to move beyond that, right, and understand how these dynamics, these influences create these effects and go through this iterative process of evolving, then you start to be able to understand that you're not a victim of your environment or your situation, your circumstances. You're not in, and you're not trying to enable it to be as it's always been. You have the opportunity to change it to be what you want it to be, which is very empowering, right? And so I really think we need to kind of look at this differently, which is probably a whole webcast in and of itself, of podcast, excuse me, of how how we can get to where we want to go, and what's the pathway forward. But in all things, we really have to begin with the end in mind. In other words, if I'm going to go on vacation and tell the family, pack up, we're going on vacation, we're going to be gone 2 weeks, you know, they always ask me, where are we going? It's like, what does it matter? Well, it kind of matters a lot. If I'm taking you, to Hawaii, you're probably going to be packing, bathing
Right.
suits, sunglasses, and suntan lotion. If I'm taking you to Alaska, you're probably going to be packing coats, still sunglasses, and suntan lotion,
Right.
but it's a very different packing. So, in order to be prepared for what lies ahead, you have to be able to plan for it, because that planning, prior planning does prevent poor performance and the like. So this AI thing is really important. But here's the fascinating part: machine learning helps understand. Okay, so I went through this process and it turned out this way. How did it come out that way? And understanding what influences created that effect, or the levers that help you understand how you got there. And it's those levers that allow you, once you understand them, to know which ones to pull, which ones not. In other words, I pull lever one, and it got worse. Okay, put it back. I pulled lever two and it got better. Good. Keep pulling on that.
Mhm.
Lever three doesn't really affect anything. Okay, ignore that one. And lever five, everything stops working. Okay, don't touch five, don't touch one. Three's not an important lever, but just keep pulling on two, and we're gonna perform better than everybody else. And we now have strategic competitive advantage because we understand the environment, the dynamic intricacies of it. But again, I keep going back to this data thing, because here's the thing: first time you send data through the cycle, okay, it's not going to be the same data the second time through. It's going to continue to change, evolve, transform, adapt, and you have to understand not just what the data is, but how it's adapting. And only by applying in this information model, right, through the structuring of it and the application of it, can you begin to understand it. Because at the end of the day, here is this: is to know what works is great today, but to understand how it works is which will make you successful tomorrow.
So
Mhm.
now you see, Lucky, why me and Nevin we talk extensively on a weekly basis.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. And the whole time you're talking, I'm having visions of things that I've worked in, in the past with creating statistical algorithms within SQL, and then how closely related what you're talking about applies to setting up a schema with data. Because before the data comes in, it's just data just plopped out, and then you got to create a schema that says, okay, how do we organize this data so we can access it. And it's just really getting it ready for something to be able to cycle through it iteratively, and depending on whatever your algorithm is, you get the right outputs, and it resonates. You make it sound so simple. Let's go do it right now.
It really is that simple, but you have to take an iterative approach to it. Again, you can't drop in the middle of the movie and understand what's going on, right? You really got to go through it beginning to end. You can't build a great house that doesn't leak water with just a great roof. You've got to build a good foundation so it's solid, some walls so you can get underneath the roof, and then you go on the roof. But everybody wants to start the roof, and that's a problem.
I think this is something that we want to actually discuss because it's coming up over and over. We're talking about movies here, right? In an hour and a half, we can learn a lot individually. But within a team environment with, say, give take 4 or 5 or maybe 2 workshops in 2 weeks, right? And start off definitely with a strategy at one point of the workshop, which will take a couple hours. Talk about data for a couple of hours, and then talk about what it is that you want to have as a long vision going forward, right? Like, where do you want to end up, Hawaii or Alaska? How long is that trip going to take? 12 hours or 18 hours? How are we getting there, right? All this logistics and all this strategy that we have to start with, I think it will require more than an hour and a half. It's not as easy as watching a movie, right? So let's get into that because I think we have to formalize a workshop where we are able to start the discussion, and where do we end up with that discussion is also important, right? Because just like we were going to go to Hawaii, if we do a workshop, right, where Nevin comes in and Nevin tells you, hey, this is where you are. I want to find out where you are and where do you want to go. And let me be the guide for you, the Sharpa that tells you what it is that you need to pack.
Yeah, so
Cool.
it's interesting you would say that.
Mhm.
So a lot of people, I've done a lot of teaching at some universities, pretty nice places, and and they
Right.
invite me back, so I'm flattered. Um, these Ivy Leagues, and some of them like the Harvard, they have the Socratic method. So let me kind of focus on that for a second. Um, I tell them there's 3 phases to this learning model. Okay. The first phase is you got to have a guy with some expertise, been there, done that, and a little experience to, okay, I know what's happening when I see it because this isn't my first rodeo. And then you got to have a book as a reference point, just kind of a baseline from where to start, right? Um, and you got to have students because teaching a class without students is kind of talking to yourself in a room and they all think something's not right there. So the problem here is this: they take the book as though this thing is the end all be all, right? And it's not. It's the baseline. It's the point from where we've evolved to at this point and where we left off from where we're going to start to evolve again. The benefit of AI, especially machine learning, is AI follows a very compliant structure, and machine learning builds upon the past structure. It's not as smart as we are. It's not as capable as we are. But unlike us, it doesn't start over every time. It picks up where it left off. So it's making very slow, incremental progress. So in a teaching environment, and specifically to workshops, right, you've got to bring somebody in that has a certain degree of expertise. And everybody kind of, oh, you've got this big degree and all this, and it's like, yeah, and how long and you've learned all this great stuff. Well, you kind of have and you kind of haven't. Learning, part of learning is application. And if you can't apply what you've learned, then really what good is it? So you've got to have experience, and we don't put enough credence in experience and value it as much as we should, right? If I had a choice talking to a master's student who's been doing, went to school 20 years ago and been doing his field of study for 20 years, and a doctorate student who just graduated 6 months ago, I think I'd rather talk to the master's student. I think they would benefit me a little bit more. And so when you're talking a workshop, you've got to have a baseline. You don't have to agree with the book. As a matter of fact, when I go to lecture, I hope they don't agree with the book because I'm using the book to prime the conversation. It's like people's like, well, that's wrong. Okay, what's right look like? I don't know, but that's wrong. Well, if you don't know what right is, how do you know that's wrong? If you're not part of the solution, you become that problem. So you're allowed to say it's wrong as long as you tell me what's right look like. And it doesn't have to be a good explanation of right, but you got to throw it out there and be courageous enough with that. So when I lecture on this, I actually even sometimes throw out things I know are wrong, just to make sure students are paying attention, because I don't want them to mindlessly follow and accept what I say just because I say it. My goal is not to impart knowledge. My goal is to elevate them to a level of understanding, to get them to think. Einstein said it best: if I had 10 minutes to solve a problem, I spend the first 9 minutes thinking about it, and the last minute engaging. The problem here is everybody thinks that everybody knows how to think, and it's not something that comes naturally. You've really got to work at it, and we don't, but we presume we do, which we know happens when we assume. That's never a good ending for anybody. So what we've really got to look at is we have to look at these three. So in a case of a workshop, you bring around a bunch of folks who accepted things are what they always are, and they do the things the way they've always done it, and they're getting what they've always got. And if that's what they want, that's fantastic. You should really keep doing that. But typically it's like, yeah, this isn't working for me. Well, what are you trying different? Nothing. Well, it's never going to work for you. Well, why do you say that? Because you do what you've always done. You're going to get what you always got. That's people say that's the definition of insanity. I just think it's stupid. Yeah. So I really can't work with that, but we can't work with ignorance. Ignorance is something we can educate them on, to say, hey, I'm not saying you're wrong, and maybe you are right, but is there a better way to do it? For example, can we build a better mousetrap? And I'm the kind of guy that says, well, I'm sure you can, but why would you? It's like, what do you mean? Why don't you just fill the hole over there on the side of the wall where the mice are coming in? You don't need the mousetrap. But nobody thinks like that. Mm-hmm. And they call me a disruptive technologist. It's like, okay, well, I work really hard at working smart, not hard. Might call me lazy. But at the end of the day, I'm not fighting with the mouse. I'm out doing other really cool things and moving forward. So in these workshops, you kind of introduce a little disruption. You introduce people who aren't allowed to present their ideas because they're not seniority enough. Usually that's the lowest ranking person in the room that's got the answer, that nobody will let them talk. It's like, and I'm the guy, if you're quiet in a room in a meeting with me, I quiet the room down. I say, what do you think? It's like, well, it doesn't matter. It does to me. And inevitably they're the ones with the answer we've all been looking for, but nobody bothered to ask. How hard is that? Right? So you got to ask, don't have to have the right answer. You really have to have the right question. There's a great book, A More Beautiful Question, I'd really recommend everybody read. It helps you understand how to formulate that question. And then the other problem you'll notice in workshop is everybody wants to fix their problem. First thing, you got to identify your problem. That's always hard. And then it's always somebody else's fault. I hope it's my fault, because I can fix me. I can only hope to influence you. So if I'm the source of the problem, I can promise you one thing: I'm going to keep working at it until I figure it out. As I tell my kids, as long as you don't quit and you don't do the same thing twice, eventually you'll figure it out. Might take you a while, but it'll eventually come. Those are the two pillars for success. So at those workshops, we try to ingratiate those pillars, right, and start to get them to open up and allow everybody to help, because everybody has a different piece of the puzzle, and you can't solve the puzzle with only one piece. So you've got to bring those pieces together, and collectively, when you get your first solution, everybody's like, hey, we got it, we're done. It's like, no, you're not. Why? I need at least 5 solutions before you're done. Mm-hmm. But we have one that works, but the others might work better. But this works. Is that good enough? No, because it doesn't give you a strategic competitive advantage. You want to come up with the best option to capitalize on opportunity, not the first one that works. And usually the first one, I'm not trying to dissuade that, because that's something to celebrate. But you also have to say, are there any other options available for this? And when you have all the options before you, then and only then do you pick the one that works best. And again, the one that might work best for you might not work best for me, because I don't have any experience in that option, so I don't understand it. So the question at the end of the day is, once we've figured out all the options and what we think is the best option, we have to ask ourselves the question: who's going to be implementing this? And if Joe over there is going to be implementing it, and the second best option is the one that he came up with, we might want to go with that one. But it's not as good as number one. But Joe understands it, right? And he's tied to it. As a matter of fact, Joe will probably torpedo option one just so he can do his. He's like, see, I told you that wasn't any good. And so you've got to understand the human dimension of this. The human engineering is an important piece of this. But at the end of the day, you've got to do consensus building as you go through this. And you have to create this culture that drives collaboration so they collectively have a stake in this. Because it's not about requirements-driven being successful. It's about having a purpose. and they collectively working together to fulfill that. And when they realize that, and I'm not a big sports guy, but even as little as I understand the best quarterback in the world is worthless unless they got a receiver to receive the ball they threw. Um, you know,
Mhm.
or at least not get sacked every time the ball gets snapped. I mean, so you've got to bring this team together. So, an all-star on the team is nice, but a high functioning, high performing team is better.
Mhm.
And so it's these interreliant dependencies and understanding how everybody works in the team and helps them work together is what you start to experience in the workshop. So that once you get out of that, you begin to have a foundation that creates a culture conducive to this, this evolutionary process of improvement and a culture of learning. And it's okay in this culture of learning to say, I made a mistake. Yes, but did you learn something from it? Well, yes, then it wasn't a mistake. It was an opportunity for growth. And that's
Mhm.
important.
Start to bottom, right? I mean, start to finish. The first mile, the last mile, long vision, reverse engineer from it, figure out what inventory that you already have that you can tap into. So when we talk about inventory, the first thing we should think about is the human capital. So I'm really excited about what you bring to the table when it comes to the workshop. That who is in that room matters, but who is going to follow through and commit is what we want to leave the room with, right? As in the fact that if the rookie junior who just started yesterday is able to have a dialogue with somebody who's about to retire from the organization, we did something right. As in they were able to see eye to eye and communicate about data, strategy, AI, machine learning to each other rather than over each other. Because that conversation needs to have design thinking built around it, in between it, baked into it, right? That design thinking should allow us to say, hey, when we're talking about risk management framework, we cannot tolerate the fact that somebody's not being listened to. And when I always appreciate what you just said is that because I'm trained mediator and negotiator, so have the alternatives, right? Like, what's your best alternative? That now, right? So you have to have a mindset of a negotiator to go into the conversation and say, yes, there is option, and there's my option, and there's your option, and there's also the best alternative for maybe all of us or just one of us, right? We have to know all these different types of options, and the way we understand those options is by having open-ended question and having everybody in the room participate rather than feeling left out. But at the end of the conversation, no matter how far or how long of a conversation we had, if nobody follows through, nobody commits, we have failed completely in the workshop. Like, because that workshop has just been a knowledge transfer, not of a action potential.
And I couldn't agree with you more. It's interesting. Back in my military days, when I had 3 and 4 star briefings and I had a bunch of lieutenants working for me, I'd bring them into the peanut gallery. Not because I wanted to fill up the peanut gallery, but I wanted them to see, how things, not just what was done or how it was done. The what was, that's at the tactical level. The how is the operational level. I wanted to get them to understand why it was done at the strategic level. What was their intent? And everybody's like, "Oh, I need to know the requirement." No, 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 no. You need to know their intent. I don't want you to win the battle and lose the war. What is the intent? And if you don't understand the intent, it means nothing to you. You're just going through the motions. So in these workshops, it has to be top down, bottom up feedback loops. Leadership is not about direction as much as vision in my mind, right?
Mhm.
Here's where we're trying to go. Okay, good. Now I know where we're going. We've stopped meandering the minefield, and we can build a plan to get us there. And we can pack the right clothes so we get there. We'll have a nice time. And in that process, in these workshops, right? The senior leaders begin to understand and appreciate the art of the possible and the science of the problem. In other words, I would like to do this. I'm missing some players on the team. I'm missing some tools. I'm missing some resources. I had a boss once come to me and he says, "Can we?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, wait a minute. You didn't know what I'm asking for. You're not a yes man." I said, "You give me enough time and money, I can do anything." And he's like, "Well, I want to do this. It's going to be $10 million in 100 years." He's like, "Well, you're not going to be around in 100 years. Then I don't have to worry about the failure now, am I?" And he's like, "What?" I said, "It's kind of like sending mail across the country." He goes, "What?" back in the day, I'm dating myself now, I think stands for 12 cents. I could send a letter for 12 cents and it'd get there in a couple weeks. But if it's a day late and $1 short, what do you care? And I've got this other thing, they have overnight shipping that I can send for, it was 12 bucks at the time, $12 and get it there tomorrow. Well, I can't afford 12 bucks. Well, then you mustn't really want it there tomorrow. Well, but I really need it there tomorrow. What's it worth to you? $100. And you can better find a way to afford the 12 bucks because you can't afford not to, right? Opportune cost benefit analysis within your risk management framework. But when you understand what those strategic trade-offs are, that trade space, right? And that planning process under those options, then the decisions get easy. But what we find most in corporate America, and especially in government, is you see a lot of this, what we call the peanut butter spread. Well, I'll just do a little of everything. So you don't want to succeed at anything. Well, yeah, I do. No, you don't. You have to pick.
Yeah.
You have to pick. You can't halfway do everything and expect anything to get done all the way. And this is a real challenge for people. But when they start understanding what can they do with what they got, working with what they got, making what they have work, they really need to understand top to bottom, as to what is realistic, and I understand my strategic trade space, you can have it fast, you can have it cheap, you can have it good, but you can't have it fast, cheap, and good. You got to make a decision. And if I let you pick two, you have to forsake the other one to pay for what you need, right? So as you put it in a three-way run, you can have it there tomorrow, you can have it there cheap, you can have it there reliable, but you can't have it fast, cheap, and reliable, that letter. And when they start to recognize that and they start working that in a workshop, then that's where those feedback loops start to come through, right? Which is the source of learning. And that's where they start to understand what that art of the possible is. We could do this if it was a priority. And the science of the probable. And the challenge here is this. I had a boss one time, and she I said, hey, I've got this thing I need to bring to your attention. I'm busy, make an appointment. I was like, okay. And then 2 weeks later, I got my appointment and I went into her and she said, okay, this worked out really good. See, you're doing great. And I said, no, I'm failing, but I'm going to work on it. She goes, what do you mean you're failing? It's like, well, I'm not working on anything significant or important. She goes, why would you say that? Because you didn't make time for me. You had other priorities. And then a couple of months later, I said, hey, I got another problem. And she got me in the same day. And she said, see, now you're succeeding. And I said, no, I'm just passing. You made time for me. She goes, what does success look like to you? That I'm working on something that's so important, is such a high priority to you that you come to me, even though I'm the subordinate, because we're working on it together and it's important to you. That's what I'm striving for.
I like that.
I thought about that, and she's like, that makes so much sense. My data folks, back to the data, so we can kind of close the loop on this thing. All my data scientists, we went to some very senior meetings, and they were able to answer all the questions. And afterwards, they were high-fiving each other, and they just thought, this is great. Now came to me and says, hey, we aced it. And I said, now you've passed. Yeah. I said, what do you think we passed?
Mm-hmm.
You answered all of their questions. Yes. And we're done. Yes. And what did you create? How did you leave it better than you found it? What? Nothing's changed. Well, what's the goal? Is to have more questions than answers. But you first got to answer their questions, or they're not going to open their mind to the art of the possible. But rather than just say what's probable, let's look at what's possible. Let's take the M out of impossible and make it possible. So your job is to help them answer all their questions. So now that you can open their minds and have them start thinking about that art of the possible. What are those options? And what opportunities could you capitalize with the options you haven't even considered yet that you would like that you don't know you like? How do we transform you from being reactive, trying to live in the past, to proactive, trying to build the future that you can only hope to imagine or envision? And data, unrestricted by standardizing and governance and all this other, will help you begin to realize what that looks like. And that's why it's so important.
Ay, 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 ay.
Ay, ay, ay. So my last ay, 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 and you hit it right on the head, and again, you make things look extremely transparent as you describe them, and I have I've taken, or at least the AI part of analytical information from you, and I've been repeating that ever since we talked last. Because it makes sense. But I'd like to just, we only have a little bit of time, and I'd like to just get your perspective here. Um, the data, but the big thing is data, but then there's regulation, and that's a big, with AI and government right now. They're trying to figure out what it is. Okay, how do we regulate? Because do it, how much like encryption. I'll just compare it to encryption. With
Okay.
encryption, you got to know what the secret sauce is. You got to know, how the math works. So how do we go to Google and say, "Hey, Google, come on"? How does all your, and I'm sure a good percentage of it is open, but there we have to know more how to regulate not just ourselves or future of AI, but what we have out there now. So how far does it go back, or how does it even apply? And so there's regulations. Just for me, it affects me in a big way because you've developed or you've worked with NAII or NI, and for the most part, they're trying to do the right thing. But what is regulation? What do you see coming up from at least the federal side or the government side?
So it goes back to our conversation we had here today on just search and discovery. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
the first piece is discovery, and there's a lot of federal, direction, documentation. Some would call it regulation on transparency. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and that's related to discovery. Okay, and that's really important. I mean, when you secure data through encryption, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's kind of like locking it up in a drawer. And if you're making a decision on only half the information or the facts, because half of it's locked up and you aren't even aware that it exists, then your decision isn't going to be as good as if you have all the information. Even if it was not really quality data, at least you understand the impact and implications of what you're looking at. So one of the things we need to start looking at, especially in the area of encryption and all of this, is blockchaining. Blockchaining allows us to do good discovery through the ledgers. And everybody thinks
Mm-hmm.
blockchaining, oh, cryptocurrency and all that. It is so much more than that. That's
It
such a
is.
small piece of it all. And it's some amazing technology. And if we stored all of our data through blockchain, we wouldn't have, we would, it would be as if not more secure than we have now, in a way that we could do discovery. And then the question begs itself, kind of the second part of your question is, the searchable piece, the access control, right? Who gets access to it? Not everybody's entitled to access. I mean, let me give you the case in point. PII stands for personal identifiable information, right? I have a right for my privacy. I have a right not to have my identity stolen. I have a lot of rights as an individual. My data is my data, right? And the PII makes sure that my data stays my data, and you get to use it only with my permission. Just like you only get to come into my house with my permission, right? So that's the searching piece. So we really need to understand there's two parts here. The first one is we need to publish, the phone book of where everybody lives, discovery, and put. I would recommend everything sorted in a blockchain through a ledger, so we know what's out there. And then once it's organized, and then structure of knowing how to get access to it, like the card catalog at the library, we talked about that, and that's the searchable piece. And that allows you to keep your private information. It allows companies and organizations to keep their intellectual property because they developed it. They have a right to it. It's theirs. They should have it used the way they want it used, and not used the way they don't want it used. And so only by breaking those apart are we able to start effectively understanding what's there, disaggregating data, and understanding how we make data fit for purpose, and operationalize it in a way that's important, but also in a way that we're authorized to do so, through the searching piece and function. So I'm one of these people who believe if you're going to suggest to do something, You have to suggest at least one solution. There might be other solutions out there, and I'll be the first to admit that. I'd love to hear about it, but that's the best solution I've heard of thus far. And so, in that sense, I think we'd all be a lot better if everybody knew what was there. Understanding just because I know it's there doesn't mean I get to use it. Just because I know you have a car doesn't mean I get to drive it to work unless you own these.
True.
Um, Other than that, they call that theft, and that doesn't end well. So, or intellectual property or what have you. But the difference here is this: if I use your car without your permission, I get in trouble, but you get your car back. I
Mm,
use your data without your permission. That's
right.
like trying to get the toothpaste back in the tube. That's that's a whole different conversation. And it's something that we really have to not we have to look at, because here's the thing: we have to learn from every mistake in order to do better the next time, in order to get to where we're trying to go. And that's one of the things that some people are so afraid of admitting their mistake that they're missing the opportunity to learn from it. And as long as you make a mistake and you don't learn from it, you're bound to repeat it. Those from don't learn from history, as they say, are bound to make the same mistakes as their predecessors. So I think we need to really change our thinking and adopt this philosophy of a learning environment, and what can we learn and how can we do that better next time. And I think if we did that, I think we would all be a lot better off down the
Oh,
road.
yeah. So glad that we are having this part two of the
Mhm.
conversation, but there's so much more to come, right? So much more we have to actually do and get this message in front of people because AI machine learning is cool and all that, but let's think about the future. Let's strategize. Let's have the
Yeah.
right step, going forward. So, Nevin, thank you so much for the lessons here. Really appreciate it. I know it's late in the day for you on the East Coast. Look forward to your return. But again,
Mhm.
thank you so much. You know, for clarifying this whole strategy, clarifying the all the little dots and challenges that we will have to face and get through it. But we'll get through it, because we are getting through it. Just that now
Yeah.
most people have to know it rather than just the corporate people, right? Corporations that are developing AI should not be the only one developing AI. We have to get in the game and change the dynamic of this whole AI machine learning development situation.
Well, thanks for having me. It was a great conversation, and I hope in some ways it's the start of many more conversations for many more people to come as they start, understanding this, not just knowing what it is, but understanding, what it is. Because here's the thing: AI. Some people think it's the the answer to world hunger, and it could be. But other people are afraid of it because they don't understand it, and the only way to optimize this amazing tool, this technological tool we have at our disposal, is not just know what it can do or how it can do it, but understand why it adds value to our society, and that will also help alleviate. You're always afraid of what you don't understand, so let's understand it. Let's dig into it, and figure out how it can best serve each and every one of us.
Beautifully said. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That for AI, from III AI, thank you. Yeah. And again, this is the second conversation we've had, when we bring you back on, and so we'd like to, keep bringing you back on, and maybe go into other
Sure.
areas, and we can talk more. But thank you again.
I look forward
Take
to it. I'll have a great day. Take care.
All right.